Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for invitation and for this already very interesting, panels this morning and this afternoon. I'm very happy to present you, my paper today, and I'm super interested in your questions and in the discussions afterwards. It has been already a very long day, and we have seen that it was already very complicated. So on the one hand side, I will make it even more complicated. But on the other hand side, I'm hoping to guide us a little bit more through and to find some patterns, some specialities, but also maybe some similarities to other cases. So the cases of compensation files I'm studying here are actually from about 25 former Polish concentration camp prisoners. And these files can be found actually in the Bavarian Main State Archive, in the Bavarian State Compensation Office, and in the Federal Archives in Koblenz. And why I'm researching on this 25 former Polish prisoners mainly is because it's connected to my PhD project. And Flossenbürg, which is like one of my main case studies, was or still is in Bavaria and was in the US zone. So that's why I will highlight today more on the US zone. But I'm super happy to discuss how it was, for example, in the British zone as well. A crucial part of these people emigrated after a couple of years in Germany, and most of them, the persons I'm researching on, went to Australia. This is just something connected to my dissertation project. So not all of these DPs went to Australia, but a large part. Besides these compensation camp files, I'm also having a look at personal research I've done in Archives and Archives quite intensively. And I'm also very happy that I could include records of the Polish Political Ex-Prisoner Association. They were in London and very much involved in what I'm talking about. And these files can be found in the Sikorski Institute in London. Yes, so many categories, and I will have another one about displaced persons. The vast majority of displaced persons in the western zones of Germany occupied, but also Austria and Italy, were former forced laborers, but I tried to highlight these groups. It's very complicated to say about which numbers we are talking, but in general, we're speaking about 11 million displaced persons after the Second World War. And at the end of 1945 to the beginning of 46, there were still about 735,000 DPs registered in the western zones of Germany and Austria. So it's quite a big number. And it's also interesting to think about that about 60% of them were registered as Polish citizens. But Polish citizens, as Poland was before the war, a multicultural state, so there were Jewish DPs, Catholic DPs, Ukrainians, and so on and so forth. Just very briefly, we could talk about that for another hour, why these people did not return, but I just wanted to highlight some of these reasons. There were, of course, political reasons, because the DPs mostly said by themselves they didn't want to go back to communist Poland. But there were also many other reasons. And for Jewish DPs, of course, anti-Semitism played a role in Poland after 45. But today I will mainly speak about non-Jewish displaced persons from Poland. Okay, now we are speaking about DPs and coming back to the displaced persons. There are like two categories which will be important now. Most of them, as I tried to show here, most of them repatriated to Poland. There were people who stayed in Germany and in Austria. And after 1950s, they were said that they were heimatlose Ausländer, and there were like other DPs who were a couple of years in Germany, and then they emigrated all over the world. Among these displaced persons in 47 were almost at least 18,000 former political concentration camp prisoners from Eastern Europe. Figures on individual nationality groups is also very, very complex and difficult to determine. National borders has changed all the time, and though we are today not speaking about the Ukrainian case specific, but it's also interesting to think about that within the concentration camps, there was no category made by the SS like Ukrainian prisoners. And also after the Second World War, there was at first no legal category as a Ukrainian DP. This only showed up many years later in 46, but in 47. And I have one number about the Ukrainian political prisoners. The League of Ukrainian Political Prisoners said in mid-46 that about 5,000 Ukrainian political prisoners stayed and decided to stay in Germany as a DP. But in total, as I speak today about Polish prisoners, former prisoners, and then DPs, I cannot say a specific number, but in total, there were 18,000 former political concentration camp prisoners registered. So we can think that probably the number was a little bit higher, but we don't know about that. Since the former concentration camp prisoners and now DPs were for the most part in Western occupied zones, they too wanted to apply for compensation. But these former Nazi persecutees from Eastern Europe and now DPs were discriminated or excluded. According to estimates by Ulrich Herbert, about 85% of these applicants received a rejection until the 1960s. Applicants from foreign former political concentration camp prisoners were largely not considered as political prisoners. DPs, they were a special category, and Mr. Goschler was talking about that earlier, that in the thinking, it was about reparation and the state should have a compensation or reparation. But the DPs did not return home, so who would compensate them? The practice of exclusion and the simultaneous limitation of the official recognized status of Nazi persecution were based on West German domestic political and fiscal as well as diplomatic reasons. Above all, the Cold War reinforced the exclusion of the persecutees from Eastern Europe, which was in any case supported by Western German majority society. The People's Republic of Poland had no interest at all in supporting those former Polish citizens and Nazi persecutees who had decided not to return home. The beginning of the Cold War reinforced this. At the same time, it was also out of question for the politically active Polish DPs to be represented by the People's Republic, since they rejected the government in Warsaw as illegitimate. And in their view, the true Polish government was the government in exile in London. Especially on the Polish and Ukrainian exile side, there were some groups and associations that advocated compensation. They appealed to Western allies, but especially to international organizations. And I will speak later on mainly on UNHCR, but I will come to that later on. That brought some improvements, but the national injured, as they were received, attention also in the BEG Final Act. But this cannot cover the fact that even after this, the claimants were exposed to considerable discrimination. Many of them who, from today's point of view, were worthy of compensation and former Nazi persecutees died during the ongoing and lengthy discussion and thus did not receive any compensation. Every applicant for compensation for Nazi injustice faced major obstacles. In the case of foreign, non-German speaking applicants, there were also language barriers. Translators were needed. In addition to a lack of knowledge of German, some also had difficulties in writing and reading. The German occupiers had deported many young people to the German Reich, interrupting their schooling. Especially the younger persecutees from Eastern Europe had thus received little or hardly any schooling. Above that, further legal support was necessary, namely that of a lawyer. In addition to financial issues, the foreign concentration camp survivors lacked trust in German lawyers. That is why an important contact in Munich became the Polish lawyer Tadeusz Skański. He had strong contacts with the Polish government in exile in London and was one of the leading activists of the right-wing National Democratic Movement. For him, representing his clients' compensation payments were a very important source of building up a new life outside of Poland. Although immigration was connected with the great hope for the DPs to lead to a better and above all truly civilian life, immigration made the flow of information much more difficult. It was much harder to get information, having contact with a lawyer and collecting confirmations of their imprisonment. Interestingly is that only a very few ask former German persecutors for this confirmation. Even if one on an individual level, former German persecutors may have supported their former foreign fellow prisoners, the Ukrainian and former prisoner Petro Mirchuk judged the former German persecutors harshly. He said, even democratic non-Nazis would consider the foreigners as inferior. There was no support by the West German political parties, not even among the political left. On the one hand, the DPs were generally considered undesirable and as a burden, as a problem, and often as criminals. And on the other hand side, they were seen, especially in the eyes of the KPD, as anti-repatriation Eastern Europeans. Some of them would have collaborated with the National Socialists, and in most cases were on the opposite side of the political spectrum anyway. And I would like to show you one case. Eugeniusz, I will just call him Eugeniusz. He was one of the first prisoners in Auschwitz, was then sent to Flossenbürg. He was very active after the war. He was a DP commandant. He was in the trial of Dachau Flossenbürg trial as a witness. So he was very active afterwards. And in 1949, he emigrated to Australia. Already in 1947, he put in his first application for compensation. In it, he stated that he had been imprisoned for political reasons. In 1959, his compensation was rejected with the argument that the Polish underground movement had not fought National Socialism as such, but exclusively resisted the enemy occupying power. These rejections, and above all, the explanations given by the West German compensation authorities, stood in sharp contrast to the self-image of the foreign political concentration camp prisoners. On the one hand side, the official rejection by the West German compensation authorities strengthens their identification as resistance fighters. But on the and on the other hand, it intensified the impression of general unjust treatment. Polish DP elites promoted their understanding of the renewed rejection and injustice as part of a longer history of Polish martyrdom caused primarily by the Germans and the Russians. The rejections and the struggle for compensation led to competition and fueled old as well as new anti-Semitism. In the minds of many non-Jewish DPs, the Jewish displaced persons in the camps as well as in terms of compensation were far better off than they were. This was especially the perspective of many DP elites in this concerning. Especially as Nazi resistance fighters, the DP elites painted an image of superiority and often conducted arguments with an anti-Semitic undertone. The concept of nationally injured, Nationalgeschädigte, became a construct to categorize former Nazi persecutors, at the same time not fully recognized them as persecutors in the sense of BEG 1. Laszlo Schirilla, a UNHCR staff member, assumed that 30,000 up to 40,000 national injured were in the West, who demanded the same compensation as the German persecutors. And Ulrich Herbert even assumed that it were about 60,000 people. The Polish DP representatives emphasized early that they did not want charity, but they wanted to have individual compensation to which they were entitled. In London, one of the important representatives was the lawyer Chmielewski, who, in addition to the Allies, also tried to induce to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to do more for the interest of the former non-German Nazi persecutors and now DPs. It was unacceptable for them, from their perspective, that even the ITS and Arolsen certified that these applicants had been kept in the concentration camps exclusively as political prisoners by the SS, but then Western German authorities denied this status and spoke of national reasons for their imprisonment. With an agreement between Western Germany and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in 1960, The position of nationally injured was strengthened. On the one hand, a compensation fund was established directly to UNHCR, and on the other hand, the Federal Administration Office, Bundesverwaltungsamt, in Cologne was now entrusted as the central West German federal authority with proceeding applicants from nationally injured. These were improvements, but the equality demanded by activists with the officially recognized Nazi victim accordance BEG 1 did not take place. Coming back to Eugeniusz. After the rejection and new provision on nationally injured, he again took the initiative. Now, however, he had to justify his claim on the basis of national persecution. In various statements, he argued that no reason for his arrest had been given to him. End quote. Since as a Pole, I felt spiritually connected to the Polish national political underground movement, I've been assumed that this was the reason for my arrest. And in '63, he also said again, every Pole had been connected with his heart to these heroic fighters, but he directly had not been participating in the Polish underground. The officer at Bundesverwaltungsamt in Cologne also noticed the differences in his statement. He studies his statements carefully over time because he also had the old compensation file with him in Köln, and concluded that Eugeniusz's statement were not trustworthy and that the applicant only wanted to adapt the current legal situation. Years of legitimation followed with repeated references to the fact that Eugeniusz himself has stated in '47 that he had been persecuted for political reasons, and great importance was now attached to his statement from '47. For many years, West German lawyers and caseworkers officers did not see the great contradiction between the fact that otherwise little trust was placed in such statements made by the applicants themselves. But then this fact was used against the applicants in Eugeniusz's case. The legal dispute went all the way to the Federal Supreme Court, to Karlsruhe. And it seems to me that not only Heike, but also his lawyers and the lawyers in London who supported him wanted to show like a very special case and wanted to go as far as possible, because they also were rejecting Mr. Zorn. He was working at the BGH in Karlsruhe, and they said that he is like, not objective in a way because he was working on the BEG as well. In the end, Eugeniusz won, but it took almost another 2 years before he received payments due to further medical reports to be obtained and errors in the payment calculation. Eugeniusz had already been living at that time for about 24 years in Australia. And I want to sum up reparation claims and individual compensation payments were already being discussed during the war. However, West German compensation practice excluded foreign Nazi persecutees SDPs for a long time, and only gradually changes set in. Despite the moderate improvements in the 1960s, however, this cannot distract from the fact that the vast majority, including especially millions of former civilian forced laborers from Eastern Europe, remained completely excluded from individual compensation payments for decades. The numbers of which groups, when which compensation payments were paid by whom and through whom, changed again under the new political conditions after '89 and 1990. However, all this came much too late for the overwhelming majority of those persecuted under the Nazis. The discussions about compensation, both national and individual, continue until today. And I was speaking this morning about the Polish case, where it is very vital at the moment, though we in Germany, I have the feeling, don't really see that point, how strong it is made there. According to information from the Federal Office of Administration, Bundesverwaltungsamt, about 400 recognized national injured were still receiving pension in 2021. The group of nationally injured examined here is a section of the highly complicated compensation practice, which excluded many Nazi persecutors more than it included them. Behind the bureaucracy and in respective individual files are people whose fates were highlighted here. Even if they were only a minority in the entire BEG construct, this is not just a marginal issue. For the individual persecutees, possibility payments were essential, especially when they emigrated or if they stayed in Germany. In this context, the failure to achieve the goal, the full recognition as Nazi persecutees within the meaning of BEG 1, was not solely due to the mismanagement of the groups themselves, as often stated. There was cooperation beyond the respective national and political ideological DP self-groups, but the rather small number of about 18,000 registered former foreign political prisoners and later DPs, compared to up to 250,000 German V4N members, cannot be ignored. Even with better, more effective internal lobbying, change was only possible with external support. These structural obstacles could only be addressed with international assistance. The work of DP activists in Germany, as well as in exile, and here especially in Polish London, was not without consequences. But in the end, they were only able to achieve partial success. Thank you very much.